I can't start an episode if I don't introduce him, the author of the bestseller Living to 120, The Truths No One Wants to Tell You, ladies and gentlemen, Adriano Panzironi. Good evening, everybody. Good evening and welcome back, Mr. Panzironi. The question I ask you right at the beginning of each episode is, are you ready to tell us another one of the secrets you write about in your book?
Yes, tonight we are going to talk about a secret, the real causes of one of the most widespread diseases in modern times, affecting as many as 30 million people.
So I would say, let's start with our, of course, introductory video.
Gastritis is one of the most prevalent diseases in Western populations. In fact, statistics updated in 2015 estimate that more than 50% of the population suffers from it, so about 30 million people in Italy alone. Gastritis mainly affects people over the age of 30, regardless of gender, and occurs several times in a lifetime. Obviously, for the pharmaceutical industry, the treatment of this disease represents a huge business, focused on the sale of gastroprotectant products or acid pump inhibitors. These products represent the first item of sales for the pharmaceutical market, but more importantly, the highest margin products, as they are sold both over the counter and through prescription.
So Panzironi, we can safely say that I think everyone now in life has had to deal with gastritis.
Yes, indeed, one of the most prevalent diseases in modern times, and I have to tell you that it is also getting much worse.
However, the only solution found by official medicine is pharmacological.
Yes, the only solution is precisely to use drugs, and I think it really represents a very good business for the pharmaceutical companies, because among other things, this pathology tends to become chronic, so people are then inclined to use these drugs throughout their lives.
There, you said something that they tend to become chronic, so it means that the drugs only serve to treat the symptoms, but not the disease then.
Certainly, because these drugs that are prescribed are precisely pump inhibitors or they are gastric protectors, so it is not that they act on the cause that obviously induces the formation of gastritis. Instead, this evening, once again, we will reason how to prevent this pathology, and we will do it precisely by following a correct prevention.
So, Mr. Panzironi, I would say let's get right into the episode. We asked our Dr. Maria Immaculate Costanzo to tell us about gastritis and its symptoms. Let's see the clip together.
Gastritis is an inflammation of the gastric mucosa, which lines the walls of the stomach. Now we can have an onset of gastritis for a short period. We can curb it, treat it, but it can also occur for a longer period of time, and then gastritis can become chronic. The most common symptom is pain, pain that affects the upper abdomen, a pain that can sometimes be felt as twinges or just as burning. Gastritis can also give other symptoms. So we have nausea, we have vomiting, we have some abdominal bloating and a lack of appetite of the patient. Sometimes, in some cases, it may happen that gastritis instead is completely asymptomatic. When gastritis is not treated well, we may incur ulceration of the gastric mucosa, then bleeding. The formation of gastric ulcers, I consider it extremely dangerous because it can incur in some forms of gastric ulcer even to stomach cancer.
Here then, we immediately thank Dr. Maria Immaculata Costanzo because she gave us a better understanding of what gastritis is, of course, and its symptoms.
Yes, certainly those who suffer from gastritis see their quality of life worsen substantially. Consider that we are talking about pain a little bit throughout the day, but then especially after a meal and after dinner, and this also leads to sleep disruption.
Look, we understood that gastritis is easily chronicized, so then this also leads to other types of conditions, such as gastroesophageal reflux and ulcers.
Well, certainly, if we only think about relieving the symptoms, as official medicine does today, so we give drugs that precisely do not act on the cause but only on the symptom, we still have to expect a substantial worsening, and unfortunately the worsening can even induce up to the appearance of cancer.
Look then, Panzironi, you talked about the triggers. We found a video of gastroenterologist Giovanni Camarota explaining the three main factors that induce gastritis. I would say, let's watch the video contribution and then we'll go and comment on it. Let's see it together.
All of us can go through gastritis, and as we said, most of us go through gastritis sooner or later. There are various causes. There are basically three general classes, let's say, of causes that can underlie gastritis. There is the infectious cause, which is the most common one related to the infection of Helicobacter pylori. Let's say that the vast majority, 80% maybe of gastritis, is related to this type of infection by this germ that just finds its natural environment in the stomach. So it lives very well in the stomach, and there, the very moment it takes root and settles in, it creates this inflammation of the mucosa and therefore gastritis. Then there is a cause related, let's say, to chemical agents. We have gastritis related to medication intake, chronic medication, so many anti-inflammatory drugs. For example, they can, to simple, even aspirin or somehow, especially if taken chronically, can cause mucosal inflammation as a side effect. And then we have an autoimmune cause, so to speak, that is, there are forms of gastritis related to autoimmune mechanisms whereby it is the body itself that at some point creates antibodies against itself.
So, Mr. Panzironi, Dr. Camarota explained to us that there are three causes for gastritis: Helicobacter pylori, autoimmune formula, and drugs.
Yes, too bad he forgot probably the most important one, which is precisely that of nutrition. Look, I am always surprised when a gastroenterologist, who in fact is a doctor who more than others deals with the digestive system, really fails to understand that there is a very close relationship between what we eat and the damage we cause to the digestive system itself.
But then, Mr. Panzironi, do you think there are many people who have the disease of gastritis due to the fact of nutrition?
Well, it's almost a certainty. I mean, you consider that 80% of gastritis is traced back to Helicobacter pylori, but I have to tell you that in non-civilized populations, we are talking about 90% of the population that precisely has Helicobacter pylori, but there are no gastritis phenomena. So it's clear that not all of this thing can be traced back to this bacterium. On the other hand, we cannot think as drugs can be the cause of 30 million people suffering from gastritis.
However, Mr. Panzironi, the cause is attributed to this bacterium you are talking about, Helicobacter pylori, because since 2005 there have been two Australian scientists, I have the names here, Barry Marshall and Robin Warren, who were awarded the Nobel Prize precisely because they discovered the bacterium that obviously gives gastritis, promotes gastritis, Helicobacter pylori.
Look, I tell you that once again, official medicine has put an innocent person in jail, because I tell you that Helicobacter pylori, while true that it is present in some conditions, in some gastritis, however, it is also found in a great many people who do not have conditions such as gastritis.
So, our editorial staff has made a video of its own that introduces us to this infamous Helicobacter pylori. Let's watch it together.
Helicobacter pylori is a gram-positive bacterium that has specificity for using the enzyme urease, by which it converts urea into bicarbonate. This specificity allows it to colonize very acidic surfaces, such as stomach walls. In fact, its ideal habitat is the mucus-rich barrier present above the endothelium of the stomach. However, when this barrier thins due to some pathogenic cause, Helicobacter also colonizes the endothelial surface. Unfortunately, however, when gastric juices damage the endothelium of the stomach, Helicobacter pylori infiltrates from below, causing a specific immune response called Th1 and chronic inflammation. The presence of Helicobacter pylori is estimated to involve the majority of the population.
It involves the majority of the population, so thanks to this video, we understood a little bit better about this bacterium.
Yes, we understood an important aspect that the perfect habitat of Helicobacter pylori is just the basic mucus layer that is on the inner endothelial surface of the stomach. And even when this thins out, this barrier, it comes to colonize even the endothelium, the superficial part, but without inducing systemic inflammation.
Here then, let us understand something. Why is it considered a promoter of gastritis if it does not induce inflammation of the stomach tissues?
Because unfortunately, when we have external factors such as the excessive production of hydrochloric acid that goes to damage the mucosa precisely of the stomach, and well, at that point, Helicobacter pylori infiltrates and then activates an immune response.
So you are saying that if there was no destruction by any other external cause of the endothelium, Helicobacter pylori would not be a problem?
Certainly, because there has to be precisely this phenomenon of destruction to allow this bacterium to enter, in short, under this membrane that, let's say, covers the stomach and then activate an inflammatory response. But this would happen in any part of our body, even in our intestines. If we have damage to the intestinal wall, then it can happen that even good bacteria activate an immune response, but that is a secondary fact.
Look, though, medicine has activated antibiotic-based protocols that are able to eradicate this bacteria.
Yes, it certainly looks like the treatment that official medicine has chosen, which is to destroy this bacterium using a pool of antibiotics. Actually, I think it is a wrong choice for the simple fact that we can take back the Helicobacter pylori the moment we eat a food that recaptures it. On the contrary, we should not do one thing. We should try to have this basic mucus that protects the surface of the stomach rebuilt, and then allow our immune system to destroy this bacterium where precisely it has infiltrated.
Here, the immune system has to destroy this bacterium, but why can't it? We are not capable. What is wrong with our immune system?
Well, there are two effects that prevent it. On the one hand, an alteration of our immune system. As I've explained many times, we have a balance that precisely allows us to increase the balance of our immune system on a Th1 and Th2 system. Unfortunately, in most people, we have an imbalance towards Th2, so that part of the immune system that could counteract and destroy Helicobacter pylori is actually not that efficient. The second aspect is that until we rebuild the basic mucus, it is the same acidic juices in our stomach that destroy the cells of our immune system, which they don't do with Helicobacter pylori, because it is self-producing bicarbonate and therefore protecting itself from acidity.
Look, Panzironi, let me pass this sentence a little bit, because I understand by now that you tend to sympathize with the scapegoats of official medicine, in this case with Helicobacter. However, I, the editorial staff, have found a very interesting video where there is a doctor who says something very close to what you are saying. Let's watch it together and then comment on it for me, okay? Thank you. Let's see it.
So Helicobacter pylori is one of the components of the gut microbiota. In actual fact, it is a bacterium that is not always pathogenic. It is one of many of the thousands of bacterial species that live in the digestive tract. This bacterium has specifically chosen the stomach to proliferate, precisely because it has a special characteristic and equipped with a number of enzymes that enable it to survive even in very hostile conditions. So this bacterium that lives in the stomach in some cases can become a pathogen, that is, it can be aggressive. What can it determine? It can result in inflammation of the stomach. It is called gastritis, which can be very mild, or if somehow the body continually tries to eliminate it, it can also become very severe. Calculate that Helicobacter pylori is one of the very few microbes living in our digestive tract that are carcinogenic. Helicobacter pylori is considered a first-class carcinogen. That is, a bacterium that can directly result in stomach cancer over time in some predisposed people. One might ask, but if Helicobacter pylori is part of the microbiota and is so widespread, is it an infection only dangerous to the body, or can it have in some way can it serve? You calculate that diseases, when they are very, very common in the population, in some way can also have a protective sense.
So Panzironi, here Gasparini was really very specific. He said that Helicobacter is not always dangerous.
I reiterate the esteem I have for this professor because he is actually one of the few who somehow asks questions and is in search of truth.
What are you referring to?
I'm referring to the fact that you heard in the video, he was saying precisely that evidently there is a role that medicine has not yet understood of Helicobacter pylori. Well, Dr. Gasparini is asking the right questions, but if he tried to find the answer, he would probably have discovered the truth about this bacterium.
Here, then I ask you the truth about this bacterium. Will you tell us?
The truth is that this bacterium is not our enemy, but our symbiont. Basically, it is a bacterium that is useful to us. Let me explain. Helicobacter pylori has a unique typicality, which is that it has an enzyme called urease. Well, this allows this bacterium to transform the urea present in the food that we eat. Urea is a toxic product for us. It transforms it into bicarbonate, and we use it to strengthen our precisely basic stomach barrier.
Here, you always make us, let's say, discover things that are totally different from what medicine tells us. Now we have come that a bacterium that was discovered, and then whoever discovered it was also given the Nobel Prize in medicine, what they said is totally wrong.
What is wrong is the approach that medicine has towards the problems, because they have found that there is inflammation induced by this bacterium, but they should ask themselves why a good bacterium somehow turns into an enemy. Well, nature has made it available in our stomach precisely to have this function of converting urea into bicarbonate. It is evident that then it did not foresee that this phenomenon, certainly it is modern because in the past, but especially in non-civilized populations, we do not have houses of gastritis. That is this excessive production of gastric acid that damages the stomach wall, and then this bacterium colonizing induces inflammation. But this is a secondary aspect, and certainly nature did not foresee this ending like this for this bacterium.
So basically, medicine should focus on the causes that obviously induce damage to the protective mucus and endothelium of the stomach. In this regard, we have created a video on some drugs that are considered to be harmful to our stomach. Let's watch it together.
Among the most popular drugs sold in pharmacies are the so-called NSAIDs, which stands for non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. The most common are acetyl-salicylic acid, found in aspirin products, Vivinci diclofenac, which we find in Voltaren, ketorolac and toradol, ibuprofen, which we find in Momentact and Momendol, Nimesulide, which we find in Aulin, well-known drugs that have entered our daily consumption. For example, the so-called cardioaspirin, used as an anti-aggregant drug, is the best-selling drug. Well, these NSAIDs are able to block an enzyme called cyclooxygenase, existing in the two forms COX-1 and COX-2, which synthesize prostaglandins from arachidomic acid. Prostaglandins induce the inflammatory cascade, but are essential to stimulate secretion by the parietal cells of the stomach, mucus and bicarbonate, which are necessary for the protection of the stomach walls.
So, Mr. Panzironi, are these drugs called NSAIDs really harmful to the stomach?
Look, I have to tell you that probably because these drugs come from official medicine, but they are really very underrated for the simple fact that people who take these drugs have to be sure that sooner or later they will have a gastritis or ulcer phenomenon.
Look, though, these medicines are among the best sellers in pharmacies.
Certainly they are among the best sellers because we take them for all kinds of reasons. We take when we have a little headache, when we have a cold. We have to think that every time we down this little pill, well, this is able to destroy our mucosa and allow the hydrochloric acid to damage our stomach in an important way.
Look, though, these sick people who every day take, for example, cardioaspirin, as our video said, what should they do?
I realize that these are people who really are at risk of their lives. However, it is also true that these drugs are highly dangerous. Certainly, the official medicine has solved the problem because after giving them aspirin or the other NSAID products that induce gastritis, then they correct this defect, this collateral damage, by having them take drugs that are pump inhibitors or gastroprojectors and other drugs on drugs. o gastroprotettori, altri farmaci su farmaci.
That is, what exactly are they?
They are drugs that prevent the cells in the stomach from producing hydrochloric acid, and so they basically raise the basicity of the stomach.
Look, as you teach us, if nature gave us hydrochloric acid, it has to do something. In this regard, we found a video, also by Dr. Gasparini, that tells us about these drugs. Let's watch it together.
Calculate that I don't know why, I never understood why, but in people's imagination, taking an antacid or even a proton pump inhibitor is something that is good for you, isn't it? Stomach acid is absolutely critical. To get the digestive process going, if we didn't have gastric acid, we wouldn't be able to start to break down from the fibers, proteins, lipids, and carbohydrates. So to think that you can block gastric acid with a pump inhibitor for an extended period of time and think that this doesn't have side effects is crazy. Calculate that gastric acid, among the thousands of actions it has, is also to determine the first process of sterilization of food. Every time we eat something or touch something, we ingest bacteria, pathogens, fungi, viruses in the digestive system. Gastric acid is also essential to give a form of sterility as well as to promote a good digestive process. Calculate that if we didn't have gastric acid, so many macroallergens in food, substances that could potentially slatentize an allergy would not be degraded and broken down.
So Professor Gasparini highlighted to us these issues due to these drugs.
Yes, I confirm to you the esteem I have for this professor, because you rarely hear a doctor say these things. He has highlighted some very important aspects. First of all, the approach that we have towards these antacid products. It almost seems to us that it is a digestive. Now it has become a common use. And instead, those who take them should know that not only they are not solving the problem of gastritis, but they are giving themselves a lot of other pathologies.
Look, then the professor was also saying about the problem of poor digestion due to a deficiency of hydrochloric acid.
Of course, because rightly the hydrochloric acid is there for a reason, and the reason is precisely digestion. We fatty proteins can only break them down through hydrochloric acid, so it is obvious that if we take inhibitors that raise and therefore make our stomach less acidic, we cannot digest these proteins properly, and when this food bolus is poured into the intestine, it can cause putrefactive dysbiosis, fermentative dysbiosis. In short, induce a whole series of pathologies as well as the alteration of our immune system.
Look, what about the allergens the professor was talking about?
This is an even more important aspect, because in fact when we eat, we also always eat a lot of bacteria, a lot of allergenic fungi that we find in nature, and well, hydrochloric acid is essential precisely to break down all these substances into peptides and then allow our intestines to absorb them as real nutrients. Well, when we prevent this action of hydrochloric acid, we induce a dangerous damage that is precisely to allow these substances to come into contact with our immune system, that is precisely in the intestine, and therefore we could have an alteration of the same, therefore bring on the one hand autoimmune diseases, on the other hand allergic diseases, or an increase of candidiasis, etc.
Look, Mr. Panzironi, since drugs are not the right answer against gastritis, we have to, let's say, work on prevention, which you always say a lot. And prevention is first of all done at the table. We found a very interesting video about this, about right nutrition, where Dr. Panelli talks to us about this very thing. Let's watch it together.
How can improper nutrition or a lifestyle that is not exactly healthy affect it?
Certainly the lifestyle is fundamental. We tend to eat in a hurry, so slowing down the consumption of the meal during precisely the consumption of the meal is fundamental, so eating very slowly, chewing well, then devoting the right amount of time to the meal, obviously.
È fondamentale mangiare quindi molto lentamente, masticare bene, quindi dedicare al pasto evidentemente il giusto tempo.
There are some foods that should be avoided.
All acidic foods should be limited. Tomato, Solanaceae in principle, fried foods, red meat. citrus fruits that tend to give disorders of this nature anyway, cheeses. In short, many are the foods. They are the ones, by the way, most commonly consumed, even the ones most commonly consumed as fast food, basically. Also, one should obviously introduce foods that are strongly alkalizing. I'm thinking of green vegetables, I'm thinking of fruits, some types of fruits. Pasta within certain limits, as well as rice. Better if we are talking about spelt or kamut pasta, better brown rice than extremely refined rice because it is more prone to acidification. Here is bread can be used as long as it is low in crumbs. So a dry bread, anything dry, tends to dry out. So basically it is more tolerated.
Purché sia con poca mollica, quindi un pane secco. Tutto ciò che è secco tende ad asciugare, quindi sostanzialmente più tollerato.
Mr. Panzironi, I was watching you during the video. I saw you leaping from your seat when Professor Panelli enunciated some foods to avoid, others to eat for, say, for or against gastritis. Why?
First of all, she talked about a way of eating. We have heard so many times that we have to chew a lot of things that are big in the stomach. I tell her that before I wrote this book, living to 120, I also thought it was a correct idea. Actually, later I realized that it is definitely a big jerk.
Look, though, Mr. Panzironi, excuse us for a moment because we have always been told that digestion begins in the mouth.
You always have to consider that we have our body, which is that of a primitive man. And imagine that primitive man maybe had to eat some carcasses, and he was not the only one to do that. So he had so many other people who had to eat quickly.
And sure, and so he obviously had to eat fast. For that reason, otherwise he would have remained fasting.
But of course, if our digestive system worked properly, it is obvious that we could digest even a whole steak, other than chewing the bite many times.
Look, is this instead about the acidic and basic foods that the professor was talking about?
First of all, I talked about carbohydrates, so pasta, and these are the most acidifying foods, but we will talk about that later. Let's say that medicine tells us that we have to eat basic foods, when in fact it is totally the opposite, because when we introduce acidic foods, we help digestion.
Look, however, you tell us things that are always the opposite of what medicine says.
Yes, look, I tell people to try. If after a nice meal we have half a glass of lemon juice, we realize that we digest sooner. If on the other hand we take a glass of water with bicarbonate, well, as soon as we take it, we have to run to the bathroom, because if not, we have to throw up, because we have interrupted precisely the operation of the stomach, of the digestion of proteins.
So you just told us that acidic foods do not induce gastritis. So what are the foods that induce it?
It's all those foods that contain sugar, again, the foods that are the basis of the Mediterranean diet. We're talking about bread, pasta, pizza, rice, legumes, corn, all foods that are very high in sugar.
Look, though, you realize that practically all people who have gastritis or very strong relapses of gastritis, they are advised to eat plain, so plain rice, plain pasta, potatoes.
Yes, I realize, but it's also true that then they don't solve the problem. So, I mean, it's obvious that there's a link between the sugar that we introduce. So we're talking about foods that have up to 80%, 100% sugar and the onset of gastritis.
But what is the relationship between sugar and gastritis?
When we eat sugar, we actually acidify our body. This acidification of our body automatically induces the phenomenon of gastritis.
So look, let's go back to the topic of the episode, our gastritis. We do so with a video made by our own Adriano Panzironi about acidosis.
There is a close relationship between acidosis and the occurrence of gastritis. In fact, acidosis is the direct cause of gastritis. In fact, on the walls of the stomach there are cells, called parietal cells, which have intracellular canaliculi and proton pumps, which upon stimulation initiate acid secretion. This process uses carbon dioxide and water to produce hydrogen ions, H+, and bicarbonate ions. Thus, these cells simultaneously simultaneously produce both hydrochloric acid and bicarbonate. In this way, the stomach is able to digest food and at the same time protect itself from acids through the basic mucus on its walls. But parietal cells are also used by the body to produce bicarbonate, which is useful as a buffering system to keep the pH of the blood in balance. But this, at the same time, induces the production of hydrochloric acid in the stomach, in the absence, however, of food to digest.
So, Mr. Panzironi, this video was really very comprehensive to make us understand what kind of relationship there is between acidosis and gastritis. However, let's start talking because sugar obviously causes acidosis.
Let's say that cells, when they use sugar to produce energy, produce acidic waste, which is precisely pyruvic acid or lactate. When this happens in our muscles, we feel muscle pain the next day. But if instead cells in our body are doing this, it is poured this acidic waste into the extracellular matrix. And then from there, it will be poured into the blue stream.
Look, Mr. Panzironi, we know that our body must always remain with a balance, our blood, must always remain in balance with its pH. I have written here that it has to be 7.38, and yet these wastes can make it lower.
Of course, you consider that we have to keep this pH stable. Even the change of very few cents can even induce instant death. So it is clear that our body has the priority precisely to inert this acidic waste. And it does this through the production of bicarbonate by the parietal cells of the stomach.
That therefore inerts them.
Of course, it inerts them, but in doing so, these cells produce hydrochloric acid, and then it will produce this hydrochloric acid inside the stomach when, unfortunately, we have no food inside. So this acid then can attack the stomach walls and induce the phenomenon of gastritis.
Look, as you always say, our body goes by priority, and so in this case you prefer to keep the pH of our blood at a balanced level.
Certainly, because nature did not envision for us a diet such as the one underlying the sugar-rich Mediterranean diet, because primitive man for 2.5 million years always ate meat, fish, vegetables and little fruit.
So this kind of diet that you recommend within the book, so meat, fish, vegetables and little fruit, can obviously help solve the problem of gastritis?
I tell her that all people who start following this Life 120 dietary regimen, one of the first things they resolve is the phenomenon of gastritis, so I certainly say yes.
Look, many times when you talk about gastritis, you also combine the word stress. Is there a union between these two, let's say, between this pathology and stress?
Certainly man has not only distorted his diet, but also his lifestyle. And when we talk about lifestyle, we talk about stress. It is clear that primitive man did not have the stress that modern man has today. And well, when we are stressed, we produce a hormone called cortisol, and well, this hormone is capable of making us sick precisely with gastritis.
Here, about what you just said, we have a video created especially by you where you talk to us, of course, where you explain the relationship that there is between cortisol-inducing gastritis. So I would say watch it immediately.
Very often, people who have gastritis have a stress problem, and this is due to the action of the hormone called cortisol, which has a role in promoting gastritis. In fact, cortisol, also known as the fight or flight hormone, when activated, is able to change our hormonal balance in seconds, raise blood sugar, and induce an efficient response when faced with an enemy to fight. When stress becomes chronic, however, this causes blood sugar to rise even at night and tissue acidosis to increase. Our body reacts by inducing the secretion of bicarbonate by the parietal cells of the stomach, but this causes an increase in the secretion of hydrochloric acid, which will damage the stomach walls.
So, Mr. Panzironi, I watched this video made at your direction by our editorial staff, and I think that, in short, it is really all very simple.
Yes, you're right. It's simple because the basis of everything is always the sugar that we have in our blood. So it doesn't matter whether we introduced it through food or we self-produce it by stimulating the production of precisely cortisol. It will induce acidosis in any case. Acidosis, the production of bicarbonate, and then the production of hydrochloric acid and the presence of gastritis.
Look, though, Mr. Panzironi, let me understand something. So it means that if we, let's say, want to fight gastritis, we have to devote more time to ourselves, so live more serenely.
That would certainly help us, but we could also do exercises called yoga, etc., etc. But I have to tell you that until we stop, what are the main causes of the appearance of cortisol, of the excessive production of cortisol? We don't get to the bottom of it, and unfortunately the stimulating cause that precisely leads to the increase of cortisol is always the diet. When we eat carbohydrates, we have the glycemic drop, and then our body produces cortisol to raise our blood sugar again. The same thing happens with inflammation. When we eat sugars, we induce inflammation, and our body produces cortisol to block this inflammation.
Look, Mr. Panzironi, let us understand how we might be able to keep this hormone, that is cortisol, at bay.
Certainly we have to change our diet, so remove bread, pasta, pizza, potatoes, rice, legumes, corn. Already this note would lead to a reduction in cortisol stimulation.
So, Mr. Panzironi, if you agree, I would close the topic of gastritis to proceed with the other pathology of the evening that we want to talk about, and that is gastroesophageal reflux. Speaking of that, I want to show you a video right away that obviously introduces us to this new topic. Let's watch it together.
Gastroesophageal reflux is one of the most common diseases in Italy and in Western countries. The percentage of people who suffer from it is up to 20% of the population. Very often it occurs together with gastritis. The treatment of gastroesophageal reflux involves drug treatment that aims to relieve the symptoms but not to counteract the causes. The most prescribed drugs are antacids, histamine antagonist drugs, proton pump inhibitor drugs, and prokinetic drugs, which are used to speed up gastric emptying. The antacids used are alginates, which reduce stomach acidity by protecting the esophageal mucosa. Histamine antagonist drugs, such as nizatidine and ranitidine, are able to bind histamine HII receptors, preventing the production of hydrochloric acid. Proton pump inhibitors such as lansoprazole and omeprazole prevent stomach cells from secreting hydrochloric acid. Prokinetic drugs such as metoclopramide or domperidone stimulate motility and accelerate gastric emptying.
So, Mr. Panzironi, the video confirms that about 20% of the population suffers from reflux. Basically, these are incredible numbers.
Yes, we are talking about something like 12 million people, a situation that tends to get worse, but which is completely underestimated by official medicine.
Look, we know that this condition is related to gastritis, and of course it can also become chronic and cause much more serious diseases as well.
Yes, certainly gastroesophageal reflux is capable, since medicine does not cure it, but merely alleviates the symptoms, of bringing on very serious diseases such as even cancer.
Look, the video also said that however official medicine has created drugs specifically to fight reflux.
Yes, have these patients take proton pump inhibitors or gastric protectors. But this is obviously business as usual. These are the same drugs that are recommended in cases of gastritis, serve to reduce the production of hydrochloric acid in the stomach. But this does not solve the problem. So this disease, inevitably so poorly treated, tends to become chronic.
So I think it is very important to understand whether you are suffering from this disease, this evil. In this regard, I would say, let's watch together this video by Dr. Maria Immacolata Costanzo, who explains just what are the symptoms and obviously the pathology of gastroesophageal reflux.
Gastroesophageal reflux is a disorder that affects the esophagus and the valve of the cardia that should prevent this valve that is between the stomach and the esophagus, should prevent the food bolus that is present in the stomach from going upward. When this happens, the acidic material can damage the tissue above the cardiac valve. So the person has many symptoms, the symptoms that are due to inflammation of the esophageal mucosa, but not only of the esophagus, also of the pharynx and larynx. So there is a burning sensation, an aching sensation in the chest that can also suggest heart problems. Phenomena such as coughing, such as hoarseness, may occur and thus, let's say, divert the patient a little bit, especially certainly not the doctor. 30% of those affected may also experience dysphagia. What is dysphagia? It is the inability, the difficulty in swallowing. In the long run, ulcerations can form, and then the subsequent loss of blood, and then anemia of the patient.
So Mr. Panzironi, Dr. Panzironi perfectly explained to us what are the symptoms, but also the diseases related to gastroesophageal reflux.
Yes, indeed, there are several diseases related precisely to reflux. Actually the first one I would like to talk about is precisely the problem of anemia. This is due to two specific factors. On the one hand, the formation precisely of ulcers that lead precisely to bleeding and therefore loss of blood. On the other hand, precisely the use of these antacid drugs that reduce the acidity of the stomach and also prevent the assimilation of the iron that we introduce through food. This is because we already talked about this when we did the episode on meat. Well, the iron that occurs, that we find in plant elements, is present in its trivalent form, so it needs a very strong acidity to be transformed into its bivalent form and then to be absorbed by our intestines. So effectively, this reduction prevents the assimilation of this iron that we find in plant foods.
Of course, but what do you think is the most dangerous pathology that is induced by reflux?
Undoubtedly, the worst pathology is Barrett's esophagus. What happens? That the moment we have reflux, we have the part of the food bolus that goes beyond the cardiac valve and comes to damage precisely the esophagus. This leads to a reaction of our body that tries precisely to respond to these aggressions by migrating cells from the stomach that go to replace those normally present in the esophagus. In doing so, in some way, nature defends itself against this change induced precisely by gastroesophageal reflux.
And this confirms what you always tell us, that nature is perfect. That is, here basically our body obviously adapts to this damage.
Yes, certainly an extraordinary response from nature, however. Unfortunately, this also leads to the phenomenon of cancer, because these stomach epithelial cells have a very short half-life, 2 to 3 days, so they have a very fast replication. This means that if we accumulate DNA damage of these cells, this excessive duplication will more easily lead to the appearance of cancer cells, and unfortunately this cancer has a very low survival rate, less than 20%, precisely because this excessive cell replication allows precisely a very fast rate of tumor progression. Consider that 40% of people who suffer from gastroesophageal reflux also have the problem of Barrett's esophagus.
Look, Mr. Panzironi, we, thanks to you, often talk in this broadcast about prevention, and that I believe, of course, you also are the thing that we all need to work on. So speaking of that, we found a video by Dr. Camarota that talks to us just about the nutrition that people who have gastroesophageal reflux should do. I would say let's watch it together. Thank you.
So the control, yes, pharmacological antacid control to control the production of the very acid in the stomach. However, the dietary adjustments, the lifestyle can be important to make that abnormal intra-abdominal pressure that promotes reflux somehow lessen. So we have another way to deal with this condition. Also part of the therapy, let's say, is the dietary advice that can be given to patients.
Here we see just what kind of foods, if any, are, for example, the foods that you really have to eliminate or at least consume with caution.
For example, mint, chocolate. Some of these types of foods can promote acid selection, enhance it, and so if there is a lot of acid in the stomach, it can go up a little more into the esophagus. Other things that are not recommended, fatty foods, for example, because Another thing to avoid in patients who have gastroesophageal reflux disease is to avoid slow emptying of the stomach, i.e., ingested food may sit for a long time in the stomach and thus more easily ascend through the cardia into the esophagus.
So, Mr. Panzironi, the first thing that struck me about what Dr. Camarota said was that one should avoid mint and chocolate because they increase secretion.
Certainly, since official medicine tells us, rather it makes us take products that reduce the acidity of the stomach, it is obvious that we are then also always advised by official medicine not to use products that are acidic in some way. But we saw in talking earlier about gastritis that certainly this advice does not make sense.
In fact, earlier he was telling us to eliminate, regarding gastritis, foods such as bread, pasta, pizza, potatoes, and so on.
Of course, these are what induce the phenomenon of acidosis. We said that acidosis induces the production of bicarbonate by the parietal cells of the stomach, and at the same time also induce the production of hydrochloric acid, the damage precisely of the stomach wall. But carbohydrates for this specific condition, that is precisely gastroesophageal reflux, are also not indicated for other reasons.
And what are the other contraindications of these types of foods?
The contradictions are precisely because when we eat carbohydrates, overfill the stomach. And we have seen that the problem of gastroesophageal reflux is precisely that a very acidic bolus goes up the cardiac valve and attacks, let's say, the tissue above this valve. And this is precisely due to the excess food that we put into our stomach.
Look, why is it that foods like bread, pasta, etc. instead induce overfilling of the stomach?
She and I talked one episode, we talked about cholecystokinin, this hormone that the stomach produces, but is only produced when we introduce foods rich in fat and protein. This allows us to become satiated, thus a chemical satiety, and prevents us from filling the stomach beyond 70%. So this would not induce the phenomenon precisely of reflux. Unlike, on the other hand, carbohydrates do not give us chemical satiety, but mechanical satiety. That is, we need to fill the stomach to feel full.
Look, but then is that why obese people have stomachs that gradually increase in volume over time?
Of course, because these people, by eating carbohydrates, are not able to satiate themselves by activating cholecystokinin, but they do so only and exclusively when they overfill their stomach, and this becomes a kind of mechanical satiety. Not surprisingly, some studies have shown that as BMI increases, so as obesity increases, the risk of getting gastroesophageal reflux disease increases.
Look, another thing that struck me about the video was that the doctor advised against eating fatty foods because they prevent the emptying of the intestines.
Yes, actually it's totally the opposite, because clearly the official medicine is concerned about making the intestine empty the stomach as soon as possible. Actually, we take away these fats and have even more difficulty in feeling satiety, and therefore we introduce more food than what should be inside the stomach. So on the contrary, we should eat protein and fat, and this would allow us to solve the problem of gastroesophageal reflux.
Look, so what should those who have this condition eat?
Well, he should remove, as we said, those foods like bread, pasta, pizza, potatoes, rice, legumes and corn, and introduce meat, fish, vegetables and some fruit.
So, Mr. Panzironi, I thank you once again for this really very interesting episode. Thank you all. Have a good evening.